They called him a monster, a horse too wild to live, too broken to be saved. But when a poor boy stepped into the ring and wrapped his arms around that beast, something happened that no one could explain, and from that moment on, the town would never see monsters the same way again. The sun hung low over the plains of Montana, spilling gold across the dry earth. Dust swirled like ghost smoke around the wooden auction yard. The air carried the sharp scent of sweat, leather, and fear. Men in faded denim leaned on railings, their voices rough from years of shouting bids and chewing dust. Then the murmurs died. A black stallion emerged from the holding pen, massive, scarred, and defiant. His coat shimmered like oil under the sun, but his eyes, dark, bottomless, seemed carved from something older than rage. The handler tugged at the lead, but the stallion reared, hooves cracking against the planks. "That's him," someone muttered. "That's the monster." In the back row, a small boy stood on his toes, gripping the rusted railing. His name was Eli Turner, 10 years old, wearing boots too big and a shirt too thin for the wind that cut through the yard. His mother, Clara, tightened her hand around his wrist. "Don't stare, Eli," she whispered. "That horse isn't safe." But the boy didn't move. He couldn't. Something in that black creature's trembling body called to him, like a faint memory he couldn't name. The auctioneer slammed his gavel, the sound cracking the silence. "Lot 47, wild stallion, untrained. Who'll start the bidding?" No one spoke. Only the creak of wood and the restless shuffle of boots. The horse snorted, muscles quivering under his skin, and for a moment he looked less like a monster and more like something cornered, terrified and proud all at once. Eli's heartbeat thudded in his ears. His eyes met the horse's. Dust drifted between them, golden in the light, as if time itself hesitated to breathe. The world narrowed to two souls, one scarred by people, the other scarred by silence. Then the stallion jerked, nearly breaking free. The crowd shouted. The handler stumbled backward. A whip cracked, slicing the air. The sound echoed like thunder, and the stallion screamed, an awful, raw sound that made even the wind stop moving. Eli flinched but didn't look away. He whispered, almost to himself, "He's not angry. He's hurting." "Eli, we're leaving." Clara pulled his shoulder hard, panic in her voice, but her son stood rooted, eyes bright with something fierce and tender. The auctioneer wiped his brow. "No bids? All right then. Take him back before—" Before he could finish, Eli slipped free of his mother's grip. In a flash of dust and sunlight, he ducked under the fence rail and stepped into the ring. A chorus of gasps erupted. "Kid, get him out of there!" someone yelled. The handler froze. Even the horse stopped moving, one hoof suspended mid-air. Eli walked slowly through the dirt, each step measured, soft, as if approaching a dream that might vanish if he hurried. The stallion's nostrils flared, tail flicking. His muscles tensed like drawn wire. The boy stopped just within reach. He lifted his hand, palm open. For a moment, nothing happened. The air between them shimmered in the heat. Then the stallion's breath brushed his fingers. Hot, trembling, Eli took one step closer and, without a word, laid his small hand on the animal's scarred neck. Silence. No one dared move. The dust settled around them like snow. The horse's chest rose, fell, slowly, impossibly, his head lowered until his muzzle rested against the boy's shoulder. And then, Eli did what no one could believe. He wrapped his arms around the stallion's neck and hugged him. The horse shuddered once, a sound deep and hollow, and went still. Behind the railing, Clara covered her mouth, tears burning her eyes. The crowd stood frozen in a kind of reverence, the way people do when something holy happens in a place that's never known grace. A man in a weathered cowboy hat, Jack Dwyer, a retired soldier with hands that shook when the wind blew too hard, watched from the edge of the pen. His voice broke through the hush. "Don't touch him," someone hissed. But Jack's tone was soft, filled with awe. "No. Let the boy be. The horse ain't angry now." The auctioneer stared, speechless. "What in God's name?" Eli stepped back slowly. The horse followed, one quiet step at a time, like a shadow learning to trust its own light. Clara rushed forward as soon as the gate opened, pulling her son into her arms. "You could have been killed," she whispered, voice shaking. But Eli looked past her, toward the stallion who stood calm now, his head lowered, eyes no longer wild. "He's not bad, Mama," Eli said softly. "He just forgot what kind people feel like." For a long moment, Clara couldn't speak. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, whispering words like miracle and crazy and luck. But Jack Dwyer didn't move. His gaze stayed on the boy and the horse, and deep inside him, something long buried stirred awake. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the corral. Dust glittered in the dying light. And as the auctioneer muttered about what to do with a horse no one wanted, Jack walked toward the rail, his boots sinking in the soft dirt. "Ma'am," he said to Clara, tipping his hat slightly. "I might have seen a lot in my time, but I've never seen that." Clara held Eli close. "I don't even know what happened." Jack looked at the stallion, then back at the boy. "Maybe the world just stopped long enough for two broken things to recognize each other." The black horse flicked his tail, snorted, and turned his head toward the fading light, as if hearing something distant calling him home. That night, long after the auction yard emptied and silence returned to the plains, Eli couldn't sleep. Through the cracked window of their trailer, he watched the moon drift above the corrals. Somewhere out there, the stallion waited. Alone. Misunderstood. Still tethered to a world that feared him. Eli whispered to the dark, "I'll find you again." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hooves against dirt. Soft, steady, like a heartbeat answering him from far away. The following morning, the wind came colder from the mountains, sweeping through the empty yards of the county fairgrounds. The auction stalls stood silent, streaked with dust and the smell of hay and sweat. Workers hosed down the pens, pretending nothing had happened the day before, but whispers hung in the air like smoke. People talked about the boy who walked into the ring and hugged the devil horse. Some said it was luck. Others said it was something else, something that made them uneasy. Eli didn't hear the rumors. He was sitting outside the small diner across the street, swinging his boots against the step, a half-eaten biscuit in his hand. His mother, Clara, sat beside him, fingers wrapped around a chipped coffee cup she couldn't afford to refill. Her eyes kept drifting across the road toward the auction yard, where the black stallion still waited in a separate pen. "Don't even think about it," she said quietly. "We don't have the money, Eli." "I wasn't," he lied, his voice small. She looked at him for a long time. "He's not a pet, sweetheart. He's dangerous." Eli didn't argue, but deep down, something in him refused to believe that. When he closed his eyes, he could still feel the warmth of the horse's breath against his neck, the way its heartbeat slowed when he touched it. That wasn't danger. That was pain learning to rest. Across the road, a man leaned against a truck, watching. Jack Dwyer. His weathered face was lined by years of desert sun, and there was a quiet in him that came from seeing too much. He had been at the auction long enough to know what fear looked like, in horses and in men. What he'd seen yesterday didn't fit either. He crossed the street, his boots crunching the gravel. "Morning, ma'am," he greeted Clara with a nod. "I've been thinking about that horse." Clara stiffened. "We're not interested, sir." "I didn't say you were," Jack replied, voice low, kind. "But I've got a small lot out past the river. Empty barn, nothing much there. If I talk to the handler, maybe they'll let me take him off their hands cheap." "Cheap?" Clara's brow furrowed. "Cheaper than they'd pay to have him put down," Jack said flatly. "And your boy here seems to have a way with him. Don't think I missed that." Eli looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "You mean he wouldn't have to go back?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Not if someone gave him a place to belong." That night, after supper, Clara lay awake in the trailer. The air smelled faintly of motor oil and old fabric. Through the thin walls, she could hear Eli whispering to his worn-out toy horse, telling it about the black stallion, about the way the world had gone still when they touched. She turned her face to the wall and closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. At dawn, she found Jack waiting by his pickup, a folded slip of paper in his hand. "They're willing to let him go," he said. "No charge. Just sign and take responsibility." Clara stared at the paper. "Take responsibility," she repeated softly, as if the words themselves weighed more than they should. She looked toward the horizon. The sky was the pale color of unpolished silver, and the wind carried the scent of dry grass. Behind the fence, the horse stood still, watching them. Its eyes weren't wild anymore, only tired. Eli pressed close to her side. "Mama, please, just for a little while." Something inside her cracked. Maybe it was the memory of her husband, gone 3 years now, who used to rescue broken tools and stray animals like they were part of his duty to the earth. Or maybe it was the way her son's voice trembled, like he was asking for a chance to heal something bigger than himself. She nodded once. "All right, but you'll help feed him, every day. And if he acts up, we send him back. Promise me." "I promise," Eli said, barely breathing the words. By mid-morning, the horse was loaded into Jack's trailer. As they drove away from the fairgrounds, the sunlight hit the metal slats, flashing like distant lightning. The stallion didn't kick or fight. He just stood quiet, eyes fixed on the passing world. The road wound through dry hills and scrub pines until it reached a small patch of land bordered by a half-collapsed barn and a single cottonwood tree. The old boards creaked as Jack opened the gate. "Not much," he said, "but it's safe." Clara stepped out of the truck, dust swirling around her boots. "Safe," she repeated, almost to herself. It had been a long time since any place felt that way. Eli ran to the trailer gate. Jack unlatched it. The stallion stepped out slowly, hooves pressing into the dirt, head held high. The wind caught his mane and lifted it like smoke. For a heartbeat, the land went still again, like the earth itself was waiting. "He'll need a name," Jack said, half smiling. Eli looked at the horse. "Shadow," he said, "because he came from the dark." The man nodded. "That fits." When night fell, the barn filled with the soft rhythm of hooves shifting in straw. Clara stood at the door, arms crossed. She wanted to say something, warn Eli not to get too close, but the words stayed stuck in her throat. The boy was sitting on a hay bale, whispering to the horse, his voice gentle, steady. "He's listening," Eli said without turning. Clara blinked. "How can you tell?" "Because he stopped being scared." The moon rose high, casting pale light through the cracks in the roof. Dust floated like stars around them. Clara watched her son and the black stallion breathing in rhythm, two silhouettes against the silver glow. Jack lingered at the doorway, hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he murmured, "you ever seen something that felt like it was meant to happen?" Clara didn't answer. She just looked at her boy, and for the first time in years, her heart hurt in a way that wasn't just sorrow. It was hope trying to find its way through. Outside, the cottonwood leaves rustled. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled over the mountains, deep and slow, like a promise of change coming on the wind. Inside the barn, Eli leaned his head against the horse's neck. The animal sighed, heavy and warm, and the sound filled the quiet space like a lullaby too old for words. And as Clara turned off the lantern, darkness wrapped around them gently. 3 lives bound together, not by blood, but by the quiet, unspoken need to be seen. The trailer rattled down the gravel road, the sound of metal echoing through the quiet Montana plains. Inside, the black stallion stood steady, head low, breath slow, but alert. Each turn made the floorboards creak beneath his weight. From the truck's back window, Eli watched the horse's dark shape sway in rhythm with the bumps of the road. The boy didn't speak, but his hand stayed pressed against the glass the entire way, as if the simple act could keep the horse calm. Clara drove with both hands gripping the wheel. The wind pushed at the truck, dry and relentless, carrying the scent of pine and dust. Her eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror again and again, not because she didn't trust the horse, but because she didn't trust herself. She had agreed to bring him home, but the truth gnawed at her. They had no money, no real home to speak of, and no guarantee the horse wouldn't lose control. Jack followed behind in his pickup, his headlights a steady promise through the dust. He'd insisted on helping, said it wasn't right to leave a boy and a broken animal to figure things out alone. "Sometimes," he'd told her that morning, "the things that scare us most are just the things we don't understand yet." She hadn't replied. When they finally pulled onto the property, a patch of land barely big enough to hold the rusted trailer and the weathered barn, Eli jumped out before the engine even stopped. The sun had begun to set, casting long amber streaks across the dry grass. The land smelled of sage and something lonely. Jack unlatched the trailer gate and stepped back. "Easy now," he said under his breath. The stallion stepped out slowly, hooves sinking into the dirt. His coat glimmered red gold under the setting sun. For a heartbeat, it was as if the whole place paused to watch him breathe. Clara's fear loosened a little. Eli walked closer, his small hand brushing the horse's side. "He remembers," he said softly. "Remembers what?" asked. "That it's safe here." Clara wanted to believe him. She really did. But when the wind blew through the broken fences and the barn doors groaned, it sounded like ghosts disagreeing. She sighed, brushing hair from her face. "Let's just get him settled." Inside the barn, dust rose in faint clouds. The place smelled of hay and oil, of years gone quiet. Jack fixed a loose latch while Clara spread straw in the corner. Eli filled a bucket from the pump and carried it with both arms, spilling half along the way. When he set it down, the horse drank slow, cautious sips. The boy crouched nearby, chin resting on his knees, watching. He doesn't look angry now. Jack nodded. Animals don't stay angry. They stay scared, until someone shows them they don't have to be. When darkness fell, the barn turned soft and golden under the lantern's light. Outside, the crickets sang. Clara leaned against the doorway, arms folded, the tension in her shoulders slowly unwinding. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd felt a quiet like this. A quiet that wasn't empty, but full of something alive. Eli sat cross-legged near the horse, whispering words too low for her to hear. The stallion's ears flicked, responding to the rhythm of the boy's voice. At one point, Shadow took a small step forward, pressing his muzzle against Eli's shoulder. The boy froze, then smiled. Clara's throat tightened. She almost told him to step back, to be careful, but the words died before reaching her mouth. There was a gentleness in the scene that made speaking feel like breaking it. Later, as she prepared a simple dinner inside the trailer, the wind howled against the tin roof. She glanced through the window and saw Eli still sitting there, head against the stallion's neck, both of them framed in the soft flicker of the lantern. When Jack knocked at the door, she jumped. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, holding out a small box. Inside were a few rusted horseshoes, nails, and an old brush. "Found these in my shed. Figured you might make use of them." "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what we're supposed to do with a horse. We can barely take care of ourselves." Jack looked out toward the barn. "Maybe taking care of him will take care of something in you too." Clara didn't answer. Her eyes softened, but her jaw stayed set. "You sound like my husband used to." "I'll take that as a compliment," Jack said, tipping his hat. When he left, she stood by the window for a long time, watching the shadows dance across the walls of the barn. Somewhere in the distance, lightning flickered over the mountains, too far away to bring rain. The smell of approaching storm mixed with the faint sweetness of hay. Inside the barn, Shadow shifted, restless. Eli stirred awake, rubbing his eyes. "You okay?" he asked the horse. The stallion blew softly through his nostrils, and Eli smiled. "Yeah, me too." By midnight, Clara slipped inside to check on them. The lantern had burned low, casting a honeyed glow across the hay. The boy was asleep, one arm draped over the horse's foreleg. Shadow stood perfectly still, like he was guarding him. For the first time, Clara didn't see a monster. She saw a creature standing watch over her son, protective, silent, maybe even grateful. The rain came before dawn, tapping softly on the roof, filling the barn with the smell of wet earth. Eli woke to the sound of hooves shifting near him. Shadow's head turned toward the open door, ears twitching to the rhythm of the falling rain. Clara entered with 2 tin mugs of warm milk, her face tired but peaceful. "You should be in bed," she murmured. "I'm where I should be," Eli said, stroking the horse's neck. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You're your father's son, that's for sure." He looked up at her, uncertain if she meant it as a good thing. Then, with a softness rare for her, she brushed her fingers across his hair. "Get some rest, sweetheart. Tomorrow we'll start fixing the fences." When she turned to leave, the horse shifted again, tail flicking lightly against the lantern flame, sending shadows rippling across the walls. Outside, dawn broke, pale and silver. The land looked almost new. Jack's truck rumbled up the hill just after sunrise. He leaned on the gate, smiling at the sight before him. Eli brushing down the horse, Clara mending the old corral with a hammer too small for her hands. Life didn't look easy here, but for the first time in years, it looked alive. "Morning," Jack called out. "How's the new tenant?" Eli grinned. "He's not scared anymore." Jack nodded. "Then you're doing something right." The boy turned to Shadow, scratching gently behind his ear. "See? Told you." The stallion lowered his head, breathing slow, steady, like he understood. The wind carried the smell of rain and sunlight over the fields. A new day, unspoken and uncertain, but full of quiet beginnings. And in that fragile stillness, hope took its first breath again. Morning came soft and golden. The rain had washed the dust from the air, leaving the fields smelling of wet grass and cedar. Eli woke to the sound of birds nesting above the barn rafters. Shadow was already awake, his ears twitching, eyes following the boy's every move. Sunlight broke through the gaps in the roof, sliding over his black coat like a tide of gold. Clara stepped in with a pail of oats. Her hair was tied back, but strands had escaped to frame her tired face. "He needs feeding first thing," she said, setting the pail down. "Don't let him get used to waiting." Eli nodded. "He's polite," he said. "Polite?" she repeated, almost smiling. "He waits until I'm ready," Eli answered simply. She wanted to correct him, remind him that animals don't wait, but something in his tone stopped her. The horse lowered, his head to eat. Careful. Slow. Like he understood the words. Outside, Jack Dwyer was mending a fence post. He'd taken to stopping by most mornings, always under the excuse of checking on things. But Clara knew better. There was something about the quiet of this place that had pulled the old soldier back from wherever his ghosts lived. As the hammer rang, Eli brushed Shadow's mane with the worn brush Jack had given him. The stallion leaned into the strokes, his breath steady, his body no longer tense with fear. When Eli reached the thickest part of the mane, his fingers brushed against something rough, something not skin, not hair. He pushed the strands aside. There, just above the shoulder, the skin was marred by an old burn scar, faint but deliberate. It wasn't random. It formed letters. No, numbers. T-24. The edges were uneven, like it had been seared long ago and left to heal without care. "Mom," Eli called softly. "Come look." Clara knelt beside him, frowning as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. "What in the world?" Jack heard the words and ducked into the barn, wiping his hands on his jeans. The moment his eyes landed on the scar, he froze. His jaw clenched. "Where did you say this horse came from again?" he asked quietly. "The county auction," Clara replied, straightening. "They said he was confiscated from a ranch outside Missoula. Why?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He crouched down and traced the edges of the mark without touching it. "T-24, he murmured under his breath. "I know that code." "What does it mean?" Eli asked. Jack leaned back, removing his hat. "It's military. The T stands for Training Unit. 24 was the division I worked with, years ago, when they were running programs for veterans dealing with trauma. They used horses to help soldiers calm their nerves." He hesitated. "And sometimes, to test how much a man could endure." Clara frowned. "You're saying this horse was part of experiments?" "Therapy, on paper," Jack said, his voice rough. "But it wasn't always kind. They'd push the horses to react to stress, fire, explosions, noise, so the soldiers could learn to manage fear. It wasn't right. Eli stared at the scar. The barn seemed smaller suddenly, the air thicker. "They heard him," he said softly. Jack looked at the boy. "Yeah, they did." The stallion shifted, uneasy, as if he could sense the memory hanging heavy in the room. Clara laid a hand on Eli's shoulder. "We don't know everything," she said carefully. "What matters now is that he's safe." Jack stood, staring at the horse like he was looking into the past. "There was a fire," he said finally. "At the end of the program, one of the barns caught flame. They said most of the animals didn't make it. I saw that mark once before. On a horse, they said didn't survive." "But he did," Eli said. "He just forgot." Jack's gaze softened. "Maybe so, kid. Maybe so." That evening, clouds rolled over the hills again. The wind carried the smell of rain and smoke together, strange and familiar. Eli sat outside the barn while Clara cooked inside. Jack leaned on the fence, quiet. "You think he remembers?" Eli asked. "Not like we do," Jack said. "But memory lives in the body. You've seen the way he reacts to thunder? That's not fear of the sound. It's the echo of something that already happened." Eli nodded slowly. "Maybe he needs someone to remember with him." Jack looked at the boy, and for a long moment he didn't say a word. Then, quietly, "You remind me of someone I used to know, a man who thought broken things deserved a second chance." Eli's eyes brightened. "Was he a soldier too?" Jack smiled faintly. "Yeah, he was a soldier. But more than that, he was kind." The rain began just after dark. It fell steady, soft, like forgiveness. Inside the barn, the sound of it tapping on the tin roof filled the silence. Clara brought 2 blankets, draping one over her son's shoulders as he sat near the horse. "You should come in," she said. "I want to stay a bit longer," he whispered. Shadow stood near the open door, staring into the rain. His body tensed with every flash of lightning, but Eli stayed close, murmuring low, calm words. "It's just a storm. You're not there anymore." When a loud clap of thunder shook the rafters, Shadow reared, slamming a hoof into the post. The lantern flickered. Eli didn't move. He reached up, pressed his hand against the horse's chest. "You're safe," he said again. The stallion's breath came ragged at first, then slowed. His massive frame relaxed inch by inch until he was still. Clara exhaled, not realizing she'd been holding her breath. Jack, who had been standing by the door, whispered, "You shouldn't be able to do that." Eli turned to him, eyes steady. "I didn't do anything. He just needed someone not to run." The 3 of them stood in that quiet, the smell of rain and hay wrapping around them. Outside, the storm rumbled farther away, and a thin moon broke through the clouds. Later, when Clara tucked Eli into bed inside the trailer, she lingered by the doorway. He was half asleep, but his lips still moved. "T-24, he murmured. "It means he was trained to survive." She brushed the hair from his forehead. "Go to sleep, sweetheart." When she stepped outside again, Jack was waiting by the fence, hat pulled low against the drizzle. "You believe in coincidences?" he asked softly. "Not anymore," she said. They both turned to look at the barn. Through the small window, the faint light from the lantern showed Shadow standing perfectly still, his head turned toward the trailer as if he was standing guard. For a long while, none of them spoke. The night had grown cold, but not lonely. There was something binding them now. Something that didn't need words. The wind carried a low sound across the field, half whistle, half sigh. And as it passed, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever truth lay still beneath the scars. The rain didn't stop for 2 days. It came in soft gray curtains that blurred the horizon and filled every hollow of the land with quiet water. The earth drank slowly, greedily, as if it had forgotten what kindness tasted like. From the trailer window, Eli watched drops race down the glass, tracing tiny rivers across his reflection. His breath fogged the pain. Behind him, Clara moved about the cramped space in silence, folding clothes, rinsing dishes, pretending not to worry. Shadow stood outside in the barn, a dark silhouette against the faint yellow of the lantern Jack had left. Even through the sound of rain, Eli could hear him shift, hooves against wet straw, the faint snort of a creature uneasy, but waiting. "He doesn't like storms," Eli said, still watching the window. Clara turned. "Neither do you," she replied softly. He didn't answer. His gaze stayed on the barn, where the light flickered like a heartbeat. That night, when thunder rolled low over the plains, Eli couldn't stay inside. He slipped on his boots, tugged a jacket over his shoulders, and stepped into the rain. The air was sharp and cold, but it smelled clean, like new beginnings trying to be born. The barn door creaked open under his hand. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wet hay and horse sweat. Shadow paced restlessly, his muscles rippling with each movement. Lightning flashed through the gaps in the boards, painting the world white for an instant. The horse froze, nostrils flaring. "It's okay," Eli whispered, his voice steady despite the thunder's growl. "It's just noise. It's not fire anymore." Shadow snorted, pawed at the ground. Another flash. Another roll of thunder. The horse's breath quickened. Eli moved closer, step by slow step, until he was near enough to feel the animal's heat against his chest. "You're not there," he murmured. "You're here, with me." The stallion's head lowered by inches. Eli reached out and laid his palm against the scarred patch on Shadow's neck. For a moment, neither moved. Rain tapped against the roof in a soft rhythm, like a clock winding down. Then, slowly, the horse's breathing evened out. The tension melted from his body, replaced by something heavier, older, weariness. Eli rested his forehead against the horse's shoulder and closed his eyes. Behind them, the barn door opened quietly. Clara stood in the frame, rain dripping from her coat. Her face softened as she took in the sight before her. Her son, soaked through, holding a creature 3 times his size, both of them trembling for different reasons, and yet finding peace in the same silence. She stepped inside, moving carefully so she wouldn't break whatever fragile spell existed there. "Eli," she said gently, "you'll catch your death in this cold." He didn't move. "He's scared, Mama. He thinks it's happening again." Clara hesitated, her eyes flicking to the scar on the horse's neck. The mark looked darker in the dim light, like an old wound remembering. "You can't fix what's already happened, sweetheart." "I'm not trying to fix it," Eli said quietly. "I'm trying to let him know it's over." Something in those words hit her deep in the chest. Maybe because she'd spent years trying to convince herself of the same thing, that the bad days were behind them, that loss was something you could outlast. She sank onto an overturned bucket, folding her arms around herself. The rain whispered through the roof seams. "I used to hate the sound of rain," she said after a while. "It always meant something broke. Roofs leaking, rivers flooding, bad news coming. But tonight?" She paused, listening to the rhythm. "Tonight it sounds like it's washing something away." Eli looked up at her, eyes shining in the lantern light. "Maybe it's washing him clean," he said. She smiled faintly, brushing hair from his face. "Or maybe it's washing us clean." They stayed that way for a long time. 3 silhouettes in the golden dark, the mother, the boy, and the horse who carried too many ghosts. When morning came, the storm had passed, but the world still dripped with its memory. Mist clung to the fences. Puddles mirrored the sky. Jack arrived with a toolbox and a quiet grin. "Well," he said, "looks like you survived the apocalypse." Clara poured him coffee in a chipped mug. "Barely," she said, though her voice carried a softness it hadn't before. Eli led Shadow out into the open air. The stallion hesitated at the threshold, then stepped forward into the wet sunlight. His hooves sank into the mud, but he didn't flinch. He tilted his head toward the sky, eyes half closed, letting the light touch him. Jack leaned on the fence, watching. "You know," he said to Clara, "I've seen men spend years trying to get past what's behind them. That horse? He's doing it in one morning." Clara followed his gaze. "With a little help?" she said quietly. Eli turned and waved to her. "He wants to walk." Clara shook her head. "You'll get filthy." But the boy was already leading the horse down toward the creek bed, the reins slack, his bare feet splashing in puddles. Shadow followed, his steps matching the boy's exactly. Jack smiled. "There's something sacred about that," he said. Clara nodded. "Something terrifying, too." They watched until the pair disappeared over the rise. The sound of laughter, light and free, drifted back to them on the wind. By midday, the sun burned through the clouds, drying the earth. Eli and Shadow returned, both covered in mud, both smiling. Clara scolded half-heartedly, her relief hidden behind the sound of her sighs. "Get yourself cleaned up before supper." When evening came, the 3 of them, Clara, Eli, and Jack, sat on the porch steps, watching the last drops fall from the eaves. The air smelled of earth and smoke from the wood stove. Shadow grazed near the fence, tail swishing lazily. Jack spoke first. "You ever think some storms don't come to destroy things, but to show what's still standing after?" Clara thought about that for a moment. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe they just make you grateful for the roof." Jack chuckled. "That too." The light faded, and for a long while none of them spoke. The world had gone quiet again, but not empty. The storm had taken something with it, fear, maybe, or the part of them that still believed the worst was yet to come. Eli leaned against his mother's shoulder, eyes half closed. "He's different now," he whispered. "He doesn't shake anymore." Clara kissed the top of his head. "Neither do you," she said. Out in the field, Shadow lifted his head at the sound of their voices. The wind rustled through his mane. He turned toward them, ears forward, calm. The last light of day turned his coat the color of polished bronze. And as darkness settled over the land, the echoes of the rain faded, leaving behind something rare and quiet, peace that didn't need to be perfect, only real. The quiet days didn't last. Out on the plains, silence was never a promise. It was a pause before something shifted. A week after the storm, the air turned dry again, sharp with dust and rumor. The townsfolk had begun talking. In small places like Milford, stories grew fast, feeding on each other like wildfire. "They say that wild stallion's out at the Turner place," someone muttered at the feed store, "that the boys got him trained like a pet." Another voice replied, low and doubtful, "A horse like that don't just change." By evening, the story had twisted into something darker. A dangerous animal, unpredictable, a threat waiting to happen. Clara heard the whispers at the grocery counter when she traded her last few dollars for flour. The woman behind her leaned in to whisper to another, and though their voices dropped, their words still carried. "If that horse snaps, that kid'll be the first to go." Clara turned, eyes hard. The two women fell silent. But the damage was done. By the time she reached home, her hands were trembling on the steering wheel. The trailer came into view, framed by the wide blue sky, the barn door open to the breeze. Eli was outside, brushing Shadow's coat, sunlight catching on the black mane like rippling silk. He looked so small next to the horse, and yet so certain. Clara stepped out of the truck and tried to smile. "You've been out here all morning?" "Yeah," Eli said, not looking up. "He likes the quiet." Jack was by the corral, hammering a new hinge into the gate. "You might want to get used to visitors," he said without turning. "What kind of visitors?" Clara asked. "The kind who think they know better," Jack replied. "Bo Jenkins stopped me in town, said he was filing a complaint, told the sheriff that horse is a danger to the county." Clara felt her chest tighten. "A complaint? On what grounds?" "Fear," Jack said simply. "Same grounds folks always use." The words hung there, heavy and true. Later that afternoon, a county truck appeared at the end of the drive. A man stepped out, clipboard in hand, his badge glinting under the sun. Sheriff Cole Watson, tall, soft-spoken, a man who carried authority like an old coat. He tipped his hat to Clara. "Afternoon, ma'am." "Sheriff," she said, her voice careful. He looked toward the corral. "Got a call about a horse out here. Thought I'd take a look." Eli appeared at her side before she could answer. "He's not dangerous, sir," the boy said quickly. "He's my friend." The sheriff crouched, eye level with him. "Is that so?" Eli nodded. "He listens to me. He won't hurt anybody." The sheriff studied the boy's face, then glanced at the horse. Shadow stood motionless, muscles relaxed, tail flicking lazily in the heat. Nothing about him looked wild. Still, the sheriff's eyes carried a hint of worry, the kind that came from experience, not malice. "Sometimes," he said gently, "good folks get scared of the wrong things." Clara swallowed hard. "We've been careful," she said. "He's not the same horse they saw at the auction." "I believe you," Watson replied. "But it's not always up to me. County'll want to inspect. Maybe bring someone from animal control. Paperwork's already moving." The words fell like stones. That night, dinner went untouched. The trailer was quiet, except for the hum of the old refrigerator. Eli stared out the window, where the barn light glowed dimly against the dark. "They can't take him, Mama," he said finally. "We'll figure it out," she whispered, though her voice trembled. Outside, Shadow paced in the corral, restless under the weight of their fear. The moon rose, pale and watchful. Around midnight, the headlights of a truck flared against the horizon. It wasn't the sheriff this time. Clara stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes as the vehicle pulled up. The engine cut, and Bo Jenkins climbed out, a broad man with the heavy gait of someone used to being obeyed. I came to talk, he said. You've done enough talking, Clara shot back. Beau's jaw tightened. That horse ain't right, and you know it. Folks out here don't need that kind of trouble. He's done nothing wrong, she said. Yet, Beau snapped. You think you can change what he is? You're playing with fire, lady. One day that thing's gonna remember what it was made for. Eli appeared at the doorway. He's not a thing. Beau turned toward the boy, his tone softening just enough to sting. Kid, I've broken more horses than, You've seen sunsets. Some can't be fixed. Jack stepped out from the shadows then, his voice deep and calm. Maybe you just never gave the right ones a chance. Beau glared at him. Stay out of this, Dwyer. You're the fool who taught this town to pity what ought to be put down. Jack took a step forward. And you're the man who calls fear common sense. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass. Then Beau spat on the dirt, turned, and climbed back into his truck. The tires spun gravel as he drove away. When the sound faded, Clara realized her hands were shaking. Jack placed a steadying palm on her shoulder. He won't quit, she said. No, Jack agreed. But neither will we. The next day, the notice came. Official letterhead, sealed envelope, the county's emblem pressed into the paper. An inspection was scheduled within 72 hours. If the horse was deemed a public hazard, it would be seized. Clara read the letter twice before setting it down. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. They're coming, she whispered. Eli stood in the doorway, fists clenched. Then we'll be ready. That evening, he stayed in the barn longer than usual. The air smelled of hay and rain still trapped in the earth. Shadow lowered his head as the boy brushed his coat, slow and careful. They don't understand, Eli murmured. They think you're something to be afraid of. The stallion's ears twitched. He exhaled softly, a sound like acceptance. Eli leaned his forehead against the horse's neck. I won't let them hurt you, I promise. The barn was quiet, but outside, thunder murmured again. Not the storm kind, but the kind that rumbles before change. By nightfall, Clara found a note left on the kitchen table, the pencil marks still fresh. If they're coming for him, I won't let them find him. Her heart lurched. She rushed to the barn, but the corral gate was open. The footprints in the dirt told the story, small boot prints beside large hoof marks leading toward the hills. The wind rose, carrying the faint echo of hooves against the hard earth. Eli, she whispered, her voice breaking. Behind her, Jack appeared, pulling on his coat. We'll find them, he said, already heading toward his truck. But Clara couldn't move. Her eyes stayed on the open field, where moonlight washed over the path her son had taken. Somewhere out there, a boy and a horse were running. Not away, but toward something neither of them could yet name. And for the first time, Clara understood what real fear was. It wasn't losing what you loved. It was realizing how far you'd go to keep it safe. Dawn broke, pale and uneasy, the kind of light that makes the world look washed out, fragile. The hills wore a thin skin of fog, and the road leading from the Turner place stretched empty toward the horizon. Clara hadn't slept. She sat on the porch steps, her eyes raw, the note Eli's, left trembling in her hands. The ink had blurred from her tears, but she didn't need to read the words again. They were burned into her mind. Jack's pickup was still gone. He had driven out before sunrise, following tracks that disappeared into the hills. The sheriff had promised to gather volunteers, but Clara couldn't wait on promises. She stared toward the fields, whispering her son's name into the wind like it might carry farther if she believed hard enough. When the sound of an engine finally reached her, she bolted upright. Jack's truck appeared through the mist, mud splattered along its sides. He stepped out slow, his shoulders heavy, his hat pulled low. "Nothing?" she asked, voice breaking. He shook his head. "Tracks fade after the creek. They're heading north, maybe toward the ridge." Clara's hand went to her chest. "He's just a child." Jack looked down. "He's a child with more courage than sense, and that horse would walk through fire before letting him get hurt." The words didn't comfort her. "Then why do I still feel like something's about to break?" Jack didn't answer. He walked to the fence and leaned against it, eyes fixed on the horizon. For a long moment, only the wind spoke. Then, quietly, he said, "There's something I never told you." Clara looked up. "Now's not the time for secrets, Jack." "It's exactly the time," he said, voice low, steady. "Because if I don't say it now, I might never get another chance." She waited. Jack drew a slow breath. "I knew a horse like Shadow before. Hell, I think it might have been him. Back when I was working for the Army rehab program out near Fort Lewis, we had a unit, T-24. You saw that mark. He was part of it." Clara frowned. "You already told me about that program." "I told you part of it," Jack corrected. "What I didn't say was that I was the one who signed off on the burns." The words hit like a blow. Clara froze, the wind suddenly colder against her skin. "They called it conditioning," Jack went on, his eyes distant. "Said the scars would help identify the animals after drills. But I knew it wasn't about that. We were testing what fear did, how long it stayed in the flesh, how deep it could root. I watched good men flinch at shadows, watched good horses fall apart under the sound of fire. And I said nothing. Not once." His voice broke. "When the barn caught flame, I was supposed to be inside. But I wasn't. I was drinking behind the mess hall. They said all the horses died. I didn't go back to check." Clara took a step back, disbelief and anger twisting together in her chest. "You're telling me you're part of what made him like this?" Jack nodded. "Yeah. And I've been trying to make it right ever since." Clara's hands shook. "You helped us bring him here, knowing what you'd done?" "I didn't know it was him at first," Jack said quickly. "But the moment I saw that scar, I felt it. The way he looked at me, like he remembered, like he was asking why I didn't stop it." For a long moment, only the sound of wind filled the space between them. Then Clara whispered, "You should have told me." "I was ashamed," Jack said simply. "And maybe I thought if I helped your boy save him, it'd mean something. That I could undo even a little of what I did." Clara turned away, tears streaking her face. "You can't undo that kind of pain, Jack." "No," he agreed, "but I can stand in front of it now instead of hiding behind it." He walked toward his truck, then stopped and looked back. "Clara, that boy's out there with a creature who's been through every kind of hell a living thing can survive. And somehow he's the only one who ever made him believe again. You call that dangerous if you want, but I call it holy." Clara met his gaze, the anger in her eyes giving way to something quieter. Grief, maybe, or understanding. "If anything happens to my son—" "It won't," Jack said, voice firm. "He's safer with that horse than with any of us." Hours passed. The volunteers gathered, farmers, deputies, even the sheriff himself. They rode out on horseback, combing the hills, calling Eli's name. The air grew hot and dry, the sun a white glare above them. Clara rode beside Jack, her hands tight around the reins, her eyes scanning every ridge, every shadow. By afternoon, they reached the old fire line, a scar across the landscape where charred stumps still stood like blackened bones. The smell of ash lingered, even after years. Jack's horse snorted nervously. "This is where it happened," he said. "What happened?" Clara asked. "The fire," he murmured. "The one that should have killed him." A sound broke the silence then, a faint echo, rhythmic, steady. Hooves. Not from their group. Clara turned toward it, heart pounding. Out of the haze, two figures appeared, a black stallion and a small boy, descending the ridge slowly, carefully. Eli's hair clung to his forehead, his clothes streaked with dust. "Eli!" Clara shouted, spurring her horse forward. She reached him in seconds, pulling him into her arms before he could speak. "What were you thinking?" Eli's voice was soft, trembling. "He remembered, Mama. He brought me here." "Here?" Clara looked around, confused. Eli pointed toward a clearing beyond the fire line. "This is where he was hurt, where they left him." Shadow stood still beside them, head low, eyes distant but calm. He pawed the ground once, then exhaled, a deep, shuddering sound that carried like a sigh from another life. Jack dismounted slowly, hat in hand. "You brought him home," he whispered. Eli nodded. "He wanted to show us it's over." No one spoke. The wind shifted, stirring the smell of burnt pine and new grass. The sheriff removed his hat, bowing his head once. Volunteers, hardened by years of drought and loss, stood quiet, moved by something they couldn't quite name. When the boy turned to Jack, his voice was small but sure. "He forgives you." Jack's breath caught. He dropped to one knee, staring into the horse's eyes. "I don't deserve that." "Maybe not," Eli said, "but he gave it anyway." The stallion stepped closer, pressing his muzzle against Jack's shoulder. The old soldier trembled, his hand rising to the animal's neck, tracing the scar he had once signed into being. "I'm sorry," he whispered. And then, as if the land itself exhaled, the clouds broke. Sunlight spilled over the clearing, catching on the soot-stained earth. The world smelled of ash and rain and forgiveness. That evening, when they returned home, Clara stood by the barn door watching the sunset burn orange over the fields. Jack leaned against his truck, silent. The weight between them had changed. Still heavy, but shared now. Eli fed Shadow an apple, the horse chewing slowly. Calm. "He's not scared anymore," the boy said. Clara smiled faintly. "Neither are we." The wind whispered through the grass, soft and endless. And though fear had returned, it had not won. It had only reminded them how precious peace truly was. The day of the inspection dawned clear and cold, the kind of morning that feels like the world is holding its breath. The fog clung low to the ground, veiling the fences in silver. From the kitchen window, Clara watched the county truck rattle up the dirt road. Behind it came a second vehicle, a white van with a government seal stamped on the side. She could already see the sharp edges of the men inside before the dust settled. Eli stood barefoot in the doorway, his hair still damp from washing. He clutched the hem of his shirt, eyes fixed on the road. "Are they here to take him?" he asked. Clara didn't answer right away. Her voice had become a fragile thing these past few days, one that cracked easily if she wasn't careful. "They're here to see," she said finally. "That's all." Outside, the engines cut off. Sheriff Watson stepped out first, his hat pulled low, his expression unreadable. Behind him came two officials in pressed uniforms and stiff boots, carrying clipboards and the scent of authority. "Mrs. Turner," one said, offering a polite nod. "We'll make this quick. Routine evaluation." Routine. The word fell like dust. Jack Dwyer was already waiting by the corral, his hands steady on the gate. He'd spent the night fixing every loose hinge, making sure the barn looked more like a home than a risk. His eyes met Clara's as she approached, and for a brief second, she felt stronger. The men took notes, their pens scratching against paper as they looked over the fences, the water troughs, the feed. One of them gestured toward the barn. "The horse inside?" Clara nodded. "His name's Shadow." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Fitting." They followed her in. Inside the barn, morning light streamed through the gaps in the boards, cutting the air into bands of gold and dust. Shadow stood calm in his stall, his coat gleaming darkly, his head turned toward the sound of footsteps. Eli was already beside him, one hand resting on the stallion's neck. "This the animal in question?" one man asked. "Not an animal," Eli said softly. "He's my friend." The man blinked, unsure whether to smile or write something down. Jack cleared his throat. "You'll see for yourself. He's not what the reports say." The first inspector glanced at his partner. "Then let's begin." They asked for the horse to be brought outside for an observation test. Movement, temperament, reaction. Clara's stomach knotted as the gate swung open. Eli led Shadow into the open field. No rope, no bridle. The stallion followed easily, hooves whispering against the dirt. One of the officials made a note. "Off-lead behavior. Interesting." "Just watch," Jack murmured. At the inspector's signal, Eli stopped. Shadow stopped too, ears flicking toward him. The boy took a step backward, and the horse mirrored him. Then Eli turned and ran, barefoot, small, his laughter rising like wind. Shadow hesitated for a heartbeat, then broke into a gallop, not chasing, but matching his pace. The field erupted into motion, boy and horse running side by side, their shadows long against the ground. Dust rose around them in golden clouds. The inspectors watched, silent, as the boy slowed and turned, pressing his palm to Shadow's neck. The horse lowered his head, breathing slow, steady. "That's enough," one of the men said quietly, though not unkindly. "We've seen what we needed." They returned to the barn, jotting final notes. Sheriff Watson lingered by the fence, his gaze distant, thoughtful. "You can write all the reports you want," Jack said softly, "but none of that's going to explain what you just saw." One inspector looked up. "What do you call it, then?" Jack smiled faintly. "Grace." Clara exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Her hands trembled as she brushed a strand of hair from her face. When Eli came back toward her, his cheeks flushed with wind, she knelt and wrapped him in her arms. "You did good," she whispered. "You both did." The officials gathered their things. "We'll file our recommendation with the county," one said. "They'll review within 72 hours. You'll be notified." As the vehicles disappeared down the road, the field grew quiet again. The only sound was the soft rustle of wind through the tall grass. Jack leaned on the fence post beside Clara. "You know," he said, "if the world made sense, what just happened would be enough." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. But it doesn't. No, Jack agreed. It never has. That night, the stars came out sharp and cold. The family sat outside around a small fire, the flames painting their faces with flickers of gold. Shadow grazed nearby, free but close, his shape blending with the dark. Eli poked at the embers with a stick. What if they say no? Then we fight, Clara said. We'll find a way. Jack nodded. Some things are worth standing for, even when the ground shakes. The boy looked from one adult to the other. You think he knows? That we're fighting for him? Jack asked. Eli nodded. The old man smiled. He knew before we did. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the night. The air smelled of smoke and pine and something else, something like hope, fragile but alive. When the fire burned low, Clara sent Eli inside to sleep. She and Jack stayed outside, their faces lit by the last glow of the coals. You think the county will let him stay? She asked. Jack shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. But they can't unsee what they saw. She smiled, weary but genuine. You sound sure. I'm not sure of much, he said, but I've seen miracles in stranger places. A distant sound drifted through the stillness, hoofbeats, faint, rhythmic, echoing across the hills. Shadow stood at the fence line, head high, ears turned to the wind. Clara followed his gaze toward the horizon, where lightning flickered far away, silent and harmless. He's listening, she said softly. Jack nodded. Always will. In that quiet, the earth felt vast again, but not empty. It held a kind of promise, unspoken, uncertain, but real. For the first time in years, Clara didn't fear what was coming. She only feared forgetting what it felt like to believe. The envelope arrived 3 days later, slid under the door in the gray hush of morning. It carried no return address, just Clara's name written in a hand she didn't recognize, shaky and deliberate, like each stroke had been carved out of hesitation. The paper was old, the kind that smells faintly of dust and time. She turned it over twice before opening it. Inside was a single folded letter and a photograph yellowed by age. Jack found her sitting on the porch steps, the letter trembling in her hands. What's that? He asked, setting his coffee mug down beside her. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the photo, an image of a younger Jack standing beside another man in military fatigues. Between them stood a horse, not Shadow exactly, but close enough that the resemblance punched the air out of her lungs. The stallion in the photo had the same deep eyes, the same proud stance. Written on the back, in faded ink, were the words, "He sees everything. He forgives what we can't." Clara finally unfolded the letter. The handwriting was uneven, each word pressed deep into the paper. Jack, if this ever reaches you, it means I didn't make it out. You were right. We went too far. The horses were never the experiment. We were. They were mirrors for what we broke in ourselves. If you ever find him, tell him I'm sorry. Tell whoever takes him in that he still believes in people. Don't waste that. Don't let the world make him forget again. At the bottom, the signature. Daniel Hayes. Jack's throat tightened. He remembered that name. A medic. A quiet man who hummed old songs when the smoke thickened. He'd been one of the last to handle T-24 before the fire. Jack hadn't known what became of him. Clara handed him the letter. It was addressed to you. Why send it here? He shook his head, bewildered. Maybe he thought I'd come back to finish what I started. Maybe fate's got a cruel sense of humor. Eli appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. What's going on? Clara smiled faintly, folding the letter shut. Just old stories, sweetheart. But the boy's gaze slipped to the photograph in Jack's hands. That's him, he said quietly. That's Shadow. Jack looked closer. The horse in the photo had a smoother coat, no scars. Could be, he said. Eli's voice was certain. It is. He remembers that man. Jack studied the boy's face, the steady eyes, the surety that didn't belong to a 10-year-old. How do you know that? Eli shrugged. Because when I saw the picture, he looked up. They turned toward the pasture. Shadow stood near the fence, ears flicked forward, watching them. The morning light turned his coat a deep copper black. Later that afternoon, the three of them gathered in the barn. Jack spread the photo and the letter on the workbench, tracing the words with a calloused finger. Daniel was one of the few who treated them like they mattered. He used to say, every scar tells a story, if you're brave enough to listen. Clara leaned against the post. And what does this story say? Jack exhaled. It says the past don't die. It waits for you to be ready to face it. Outside, the wind stirred the fields, bending the dry grass like a sea. Eli was silent for a long moment, then said, Maybe that's why he came here, to finish his story. Shadow stood at the open barn door, his body outlined against the sun. The horse stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until he was close enough for the boy to touch his muzzle. Eli reached out, his hand resting lightly against the warm skin. You knew him, didn't you? He whispered. The man who wrote the letter. The stallion's ears twitched, his breath deep and slow. In his eyes was something unfathomable. Grief, maybe, or recognition. Clara found herself holding her breath. Jack swallowed hard. You know, in the service, we kept records of every horse we trained. They had numbers, not names. But Daniel, he used to whisper names to them anyway, said they deserved to be remembered as something more than property. He looked at Shadow. He called this one Redemption. Eli smiled faintly. That's a good name. Yeah, Jack said. Too good, for the life we gave him. The rest of the day moved in silence. Clara fixed lunch but forgot to eat. Jack sat outside the barn, the letter open beside him, his eyes far away. And Eli stayed with Shadow, brushing his coat, humming under his breath. It wasn't a song anyone recognized, but it was enough to keep the air gentle. That evening, a soft drizzle began to fall, one of those half-hearted rains that smell more of memory than weather. Clara stood at the window, watching the drops hit the porch rail. Jack was still outside, his silhouette a quiet shape against the fading light. You should come in, she called through the screen door. Can't yet, he said without turning. Feels like Daniel's here somehow. Feels wrong to leave him waiting. She stepped out and handed him a blanket. You think he sent that letter for forgiveness? Jack shook his head. No. I think he sent it for witness. So someone would remember what was lost, and what wasn't. Clara looked toward the pasture. Eli was standing with Shadow under the rain, his hand on the horse's neck, both of them still as statues. The gray sky pressed low, swallowing sound. Some things don't need saving, she said softly. They just need to be seen. Jack nodded, his eyes wet, though the rain gave him an excuse. By nightfall, the storm drifted away, leaving the land slick and shining. The air smelled of pine and iron and wet earth. In the barn, the letter sat pinned to the wall beside the photo, the ink smudged slightly where a drop of water had fallen. Eli came in to find Clara kneeling by the stall, whispering to Shadow. She turned and smiled. "We're keeping it there," she said, "so we don't forget who he was before he became ours." The boy nodded. "And who we were before he found us." Jack stood by the door, watching them, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. For the first time since he'd confessed his sins, the weight in his chest felt lighter. Not gone, but bearable. He looked at the photo one last time. The younger version of himself stared back with eyes that hadn't yet seen regret. Between them stood the same horse, alive, whole, waiting. "You kept believing," he murmured, "even when we didn't deserve it." Outside, the stars began to return, faint pinpricks in the clearing sky. The wind carried the scent of rain and sage, of endings that might finally be turning into beginnings. And in the quiet that followed, the letter rustled softly on the wall, as if the past itself was breathing again, no longer demanding forgiveness, only peace. The first light of dawn came slow, spilling across the horizon like honey. It touched the barn roof, slid down the side of the trailer, and caught on the dew clinging to the grass. The world was washed clean again. The storm had moved east, leaving behind a silence so complete it almost hummed. Clara stood on the porch, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, watching the sky shift from gray to gold. Behind her, the house was quiet. Jack had fallen asleep in the old armchair, the letter from Daniel Hayes still folded neatly in his breast pocket. Eli was already outside, barefoot in the cold, walking toward the corral with the confidence of someone much older than his years. His small frame cut a shadow against the rising sun. Shadow lifted his head at the sound of footsteps. His ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring as Eli approached. For a moment, the two simply looked at each other. Then the boy reached up, resting his palm against the horse's neck. "You ready?" he whispered. "Today's the day we show them you belong here." From behind the fence, Jack's voice broke the stillness. "He already belongs," he said. "We're the ones catching up." The county's decision had come late the previous night. Sheriff Watson had stopped by in person, handing Clara an envelope sealed with the county crest. Inside, a single page. Case closed. Animal cleared for permanent residence under supervision of Jack Dwyer. It wasn't the grand victory anyone expected, but it was enough. Now, as the morning bloomed fully awake, the air carried a warmth that felt like mercy. Clara set her mug down and walked toward the field. Jack followed, his limp more noticeable in the early cold. Eli was already unhooking the gate, his hands steady on the latch. "Let him run," Jack said softly. Eli hesitated. "What if he doesn't come back?" Clara smiled. "Then we'll wait until he does." The gate swung open with a groan. For a moment, Shadow didn't move. His muscles tensed beneath his dark coat, his eyes scanning the open field as if weighing the cost of freedom. Then, with one great exhale, he stepped forward. And then he ran. It wasn't the panicked sprint of a trapped animal or the forced gallop of a show horse. It was pure motion, effortless and wild. His mane streamed behind him, catching the sunlight like black fire. The ground shook under the power of his stride, each hoofbeat a drum echoing across the valley. Eli ran too, chasing after him, laughter spilling out between breaths. For a few seconds, boy and horse moved together, One heartbeat, one rhythm. Clara watched from the fence, her eyes wide, tears threatening. Jack's hand rested on her shoulder. "That's what healing looks like," he said quietly. The stallion reached the far edge of the field and stopped, turning back. The sun lit him from behind, outlining his form in gold. He pawed the ground once, as if marking his place in the world, and then began to walk back, slowly, deliberately. Eli met him halfway, chest heaving, cheeks flushed. "You came back," he said between breaths. Shadow lowered his head until his forehead pressed gently against the boy's. The two of them stood there, unmoving, framed by the endless sweep of the field. Clara felt something inside her chest loosen, something that had been wound tight since the day her husband died. Jack leaned on the fence post, watching with eyes that had seen too much war and regret. "You ever notice," he said softly, "how sometimes the hardest part isn't the pain itself, it's remembering how to live after it's gone?" Clara looked at him. "You think we'll ever stop remembering?" Jack smiled faintly. "No, but maybe we'll remember better." Later that afternoon, the three of them sat in the grass near the barn, lunch spread on a faded blanket. The wind was gentle, carrying the sweet scent of clover. Shadow grazed nearby, his coat shining like onyx in the sun. Eli was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Do you think he knows it's over?" Clara followed his gaze. "I think he knows he's home." Jack unfolded the letter again, reading the last lines aloud, not as confession this time, but as prayer. "He sees everything. He forgives what we can't." When he finished, no one spoke. The world around them felt vast, open, and kind. As the day stretched toward evening, the light deepened into a warm, golden haze. The grass shimmered under the setting sun. Eli climbed the fence, perching on the top rail, his legs swinging idly. "It looks like the whole field's on fire," he said. Jack smiled. "That's the kind of fire worth keeping." The horse lifted his head, ears twitching at the sound of the boy's voice. Eli hopped down, ran into the middle of the field, and turned in a slow circle, arms outstretched. The last light of the sun painted him and the horse in the same burnished glow. A boy and a creature once broken, now whole. Clara took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs like something new. She didn't think about the past anymore, or about the fear that had lived under her ribs for years. She thought about this moment. Simple, quiet, infinite. Jack rose from where he sat, stretching against the ache in his back. "You know," he said, "if someone drove by right now, they'd think they were looking at a miracle." Clara's smile was small, but true. Maybe they are. The light shifted once more, the sun dipping low enough to turn everything the color of wheat. The field glowed, a sea of gold stretching beyond what the eye could hold. Shadow lifted his head and began to run again, his hooves flashing in the amber light. Eli ran after him, laughing, his voice echoing across the open land. Clara and Jack stood at the fence, side by side, their shadows long behind them. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. When the boy finally slowed, collapsing into the grass, Shadow circled once before lying down beside him. The sky above them was a cathedral of orange and rose, the kind of beauty that demanded silence. Jack removed his hat, holding it over his heart. "They called him a monster," he said softly. Turns out he was just waiting for someone brave enough to believe. Clara reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining in quiet, understanding. As the last light faded, the sound of laughter and hoofbeats melted into the hum of crickets and the rustle of wind through the grass. Night crept in gently, wrapping the land in blue, and there, under the wide Montana sky, 3 souls, one broken, one healing, one forgiven, finally rested. The field shimmered once more before the dark claimed it, the gold fading into memory, but not loss. Because some moments don't end. They stay, alive, breathing, waiting to remind us that love once found never truly leaves. If this story touched something in you, tell me what part stayed with you the most. I read every comment, and your thoughts mean more than you know. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with me for the next story, because sometimes the quietest tales are the ones that change us forever.